She had one of those very full skirts on, got hold of her skirt.
I am reminded of the deeply touching letters, cards, and messages.
In a jaw-dropping twist, rumors say King Charles has completely turned his back on Camilla. And it's not just emotional. We're talking titles, power, and every single penny. What triggered this royal fallout? The whispers are louder than ever. Hit that subscribe button for more royal drama updates. The palace walls may be thick, but they couldn't contain what was brewing behind them. A letter arrived at Buckingham Palace. Short, official, and wrapped in formality. On the surface, it was just a notice. Queen Camilla wouldn't be attending the upcoming 50th anniversary celebration of the Royal Charitable Trust. The reason? A packed schedule. But King Charles didn't need to read between the lines. He felt the message loud and clear. It wasn't about scheduling at all. It was about priorities. Charles held the letter in his hands for longer than necessary, reading it over and over, not because he didn't understand it, but because he was searching for something, anything, that might hint at care, affection, or apology. There was none, just the cold formality of a royal obligation being quietly declined. And that, in its simplicity, struck harder than any dramatic confrontation ever could. He sat in his private library, the room bathed in the golden light of a fading afternoon. Outside, the gardens flourished under the summer sun, birds chirping and leaves rustling gently in the breeze. But inside, the air felt heavy. The fireplace crackled, though the flames didn't offer comfort. Charles's eyes stayed locked on the letter, his thoughts spinning through years of memories, both warm and bitter. For a long time, he had believed in Camilla. He had trusted her, protected her, even reshaped the monarchy in her favor. But now he was beginning to ask himself, had he been blind? The woman who once stood by his side now seemed miles away, not just physically, but emotionally. While he was battling illness, it hadn't gone unnoticed that she kept making appearances, gala dinners, public ceremonies, even high society parties. Not once had she asked the palace staff for updates on his health. Not once had she visited without a camera nearby. This letter was just the latest in a string of signs he could no longer ignore. He clenched his jaw, trying to steady the growing storm inside him. For decades, he had carried the weight of decisions that shaped not just his life, but the monarchy's future. Choosing Camilla over Diana had been the most controversial, and now possibly the most regrettable, decision of all. His fingers ran across the crest embossed on the letterhead, and suddenly, everything felt like an illusion. Had he really chosen love all those years ago? Or had he traded something deeper for companionship that was never truly loyal? And yet, this wasn't the end, not even close. Because something else had arrived, something not sent by Camilla, but connected to someone Charles had never fully let go of. A relic from the past, wrapped in emotion, and sealed with a truth he had tried to forget. A voice was about to return, and with it, a truth that would leave no room for denial. Before the letter, before the unraveling, there were quiet signs, moments so subtle that even a king missed them. But looking back, they weren't small at all. They were warning flares, hidden in plain sight. It began during the toughest chapter of Charles's life, early 2024, when his health was in steep decline. Sandringham had become his refuge, but not by choice. The once vibrant estate now served as a kind of retreat from the world, filled with medical machines, hushed voices, and round-the-clock care. The man who once commanded global attention was reduced to waiting for news, for progress, and for visitors who never came. Most notably, Camilla. She wasn't there, not in the hospital room, not in the corridors, not in the late evenings when Charles needed comfort more than ceremony. Instead, her name floated through tabloid headlines, often paired with words like elegant, regal, and unshakable. She smiled on red carpets and made glowing speeches at charity banquets. The press loved her. The public saw a queen standing tall while the king battled quietly in the background. But behind those headlines, the reality felt different. Camilla's absence wasn't just physical, it was emotional. There were no late-night phone calls, no handwritten notes left at his bedside. What Charles received were formal updates from her aides, carefully worded, always polite, never warm. And in that silence, something inside him started to change. During those long days, Charles found solace in memories. He kept an old photo album by his bedside, filled with pictures from years gone by, many of them featuring Diana. The one he kept turning back to was from Highgrove, 1987. In it, Diana stood behind him, sunlight catching the gentle curve of her smile. She wasn't dressed for attention. She wasn't posing. She was just there, present, genuine. In that photo, she looked at him not as a prince, not as a future king, but as a man, a husband, a father. And it hit him. She had wanted him, not the crown. The comparison to Camilla grew painful. Where Diana had offered love, Camilla had pursued position. Where Diana had shielded him in moments of doubt, Camilla had positioned herself in the spotlight. He remembered something Diana once said to him. An evening years ago at Kensington Palace, her eyes red but determined. "You don't have to choose between me and the throne, but if you choose her, you'll lose both." He hadn't listened. Back then, he thought it was drama, emotion, maybe even jealousy. But now, those words echoed through him like a prophecy. And perhaps the most painful part? She hadn't said it to hurt him. She said it to save him. Charles had made his choices. And now those choices were circling back. The silence of those lonely months had made that clearer than any headline ever could. But clarity alone doesn't force change. It takes something stronger. And that something, unexpected and haunting, was already on its way. A voice from the past was about to speak again. Some turning points arrive quietly. No announcements, no headlines, just a single moment that cracks everything open. It was a mild morning in May 2025 when Prince William walked into his father's sitting room at Sandringham. His expression was calm, but there was a heaviness in his step. In his hands, he held something unexpected, an old leather box, worn at the edges, the kind you don't just stumble upon. It looked aged, personal, and purposeful. Charles, curious but cautious, asked what it was. William gently placed the box on the table between them. "You need to hear this," he said simply. Inside, carefully wrapped in tissue, was a cassette tape. Alongside it, a handwritten note. The ink was faint, but unmistakable. It was Diana's handwriting. The message was brief, written in her final days. For Charles, if he ever needs the truth. Charles froze. He hadn't seen that handwriting in decades. Just seeing her words again felt like time had folded in on itself. With trembling hands, he inserted the tape into an old player brought in by an aide. Then the room changed. Diana's voice filled the air. Sean, warm but layered with emotion. It wasn't the polished public voice the world knew. This was raw, personal. "Charles," she said, her tone fragile yet clear, "if you're listening to this, maybe you've seen it for yourself. Maybe now you understand. You deserve someone who loves you, not your title, not your crown, just you. And if you still can, protect our children. That's all I ask." There was a long pause on the tape. Then the recording ended. No dramatics, no accusations, just the truth. Charles didn't speak for a long time. His eyes glistened, his fingers still resting on the edge of the tape recorder. The room, once filled with sunlight, now felt still, like the very air was listening. In that moment, it all collapsed. The illusion, the excuses, the justifications. He had spent years convincing himself that choosing Camilla was worth the fallout, that it had been love, that the cost had been painful, but acceptable. But Diana's voice shattered those ideas. She hadn't been trying to haunt him, she was trying to reach him, to remind him that beyond the pageantry, beyond the duty, he was still just a man, one who had made a heartbreaking mistake. And now that mistake stood in front of him, not just as a memory, but as a consequence. The voice on that tape didn't just stir regret, it lit a fire. He realized Camilla hadn't just taken space in his life. She had consumed it, and in return, she gave him status, but not substance. Charles wiped his eyes. His voice was low but steady. "It's time," he said. He didn't explain what he meant. He didn't need to. But from that moment on, things inside the palace would begin to shift, and it would all begin with a single decision: to act on the truth he could no longer ignore. The change started subtly. There were no official statements, no breaking news, just a quiet storm brewing behind the palace gates. Charles, still recovering but clear in mind and purpose, made a call to his most trusted legal advisor. He wanted to review everything: Camilla's privileges, her access, her legal protections, and most importantly, her place in the monarchy going forward. It wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, calculated, and deeply personal. Behind the scenes, the palace machinery began to shift. Close aides once loyal to Camilla were quietly reassigned. Scheduled appearances were postponed. Access to certain internal documents was restricted. Camilla hadn't been officially informed yet, but she felt the atmosphere shift. The once smooth corridors of royal power now echoed with quiet footsteps and hushed conversations. The queen who once seemed untouchable was suddenly isolated. Meanwhile, Charles did something unexpected. He started meeting with Catherine, Princess of Wales, more frequently. The meetings were discreet, but their purpose was clear. He wasn't just rethinking Camilla's role. He was preparing someone else to step forward. And the world began to notice. Just months earlier, Camilla had accompanied Charles on a state visit to South Korea. The trip was meant to be a demonstration of royal unity, but instead, it turned into something else entirely. Camilla stood alongside South Korea's First Lady, a woman full of warmth and modern elegance. Cameras flashed, but it was Catherine standing quietly in the background who stole the show. Dressed simply, with an ease and grace that came from sincerity, not status, she captivated the international press. One newspaper in Seoul ran the headline, "The jewel of the British monarchy isn't wearing a crown." Back in their hotel suite, Camilla read the coverage. Again and again. She tried to laugh it off, but her clenched jaw betrayed her frustration. Later that evening, she summoned Catherine for a private word. The tone was polite, but firm. "Don't wear red at the next event," Camilla said. "It draws too much attention." Catherine, ever poised, nodded gently. She didn't protest, but she understood exactly what was happening. Camilla was feeling threatened. Days later, at a state banquet, Camilla arrived in a deep red gown, gleaming with rubies. She smiled for the cameras, her posture tall, her expression proud, but something was off. The smile looked tight. The confidence, forced. The press noticed. And this time they didn't hold back. One headline read, "The desperate queen in red when insecurity wears a crown." It was no longer just royal gossip. It was image warfare, and Camilla was losing the battle. Her move to sideline Catherine had backfired. Public sentiment had shifted. Social media lit up with comparisons, side-by-side photos, quotes, and commentary. Catherine was rising, not because she tried to take anything, but because she didn't. Camilla, who once believed she had finally secured her place at the heart of the monarchy, now found herself watching it slip away, not because of scandal, but because of authenticity. And soon she would find herself facing a moment she never expected, a meeting that would change everything. The palace was unusually quiet that evening. Inside one of Buckingham's most private chambers, walls lined with tapestries and centuries-old oil paintings, a meeting was about to take place that would never be listed on any official calendar. King Charles had summoned two women, Camilla and Catherine. It wasn't a press event. There were no cameras, no aides, no distractions, just the three of them, a triangle of history, tension, and truth. Charles sat first, his posture upright but weary. His illness had aged him, yes, but there was also strength in his eyes, clarity that hadn't been there in years. On his left stood Camilla, dressed in an elegant black silk gown, her usual air of control somewhat faded. On his right, Catherine, quiet, calm, and poised in a soft pale blue dress. Not flashy, but dignified. The silence stretched. Camilla broke it first. Her voice trembled, not with sadness, but with frustration. "She's just Diana's shadow," she said, gesturing slightly toward Catherine. "My entire life I've been compared to her, haunted by her name, and now, this." Charles didn't flinch. He listened, but his expression didn't shift. Camilla went on. "I'm the one who stayed, Charles. I stood beside you when everyone else turned away, and now you reward that by elevating her?" Her words fell heavy in the room, each one laced with defensiveness. But something else crept in. Fear. Fear of losing not just a title, but everything she'd spent decades building. Catherine didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was power. In a world obsessed with image, her sincerity spoke louder than words. Then Charles looked at Camilla. "I once thought love was about loyalty," he said softly. "But I confused loyalty with control. I confused companionship with care." He paused, turning to Catherine briefly, then back to Camilla. "Today, I choose the light," he said, "and that is not you." The words hit like thunder. Camilla didn't respond immediately. Her face tightened, her breath caught. She stood frozen, the weight of the moment sinking in. She had fought so long to become queen. And in one sentence, that illusion shattered. With slow, deliberate steps, she turned and walked toward the door. Her heels clicked sharply against the marble floor, each step echoing like a final chapter closing behind her. The door shut quietly, and just like that, the balance of the monarchy shifted. Charles turned to Catherine, his expression softer now. "You didn't ask for this," he said. Catherine nodded, her eyes full of empathy. "No," she replied gently. But if it helps bring dignity back to this family, I'll carry it with grace. Outside that room, the world hadn't changed yet, but inside, the path forward had been drawn with absolute clarity. One era had ended, and another had quietly begun. Change doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in the form of quiet resolve, in gentle steps, not loud declarations. And in the weeks that followed the private confrontation at Buckingham Palace, it became clear Catherine wasn't stepping in to replace anyone. She was stepping forward to restore something that had long been fading. Inside Kensington Palace, the tone shifted. Meetings that were once ceremonial began to take on real purpose. Catherine sat at the table not as a symbolic figure, but as someone ready to lead with clarity, kindness, and intention. Her schedule filled quickly, not with galas or grand photo ops, but with working sessions alongside royal advisors, strategists, and charitable directors. She wasn't there to take the spotlight, she was there to do the work, and people noticed. At one early meeting, she made a quiet but firm request: expand efforts for underserved families, especially programs focused on children's mental health and early childhood development. She spoke of Diana, not in legacy terms, but in heart terms. She didn't just shake hands, Catherine said. She listened. She made people feel seen. That's what we have to bring back. Her words weren't met with silence. They were met with nods. Even some of the palace's longest-serving advisors, people who had seen generations come and go, felt something stir. One was heard whispering, "We haven't had this kind of sincerity in years." The public began to sense it too. At a Commonwealth conference in London, Catherine made her first formal appearance since the royal shakeup. She wore a simple blue dress, no crown, no diamonds, just poise and grace. Her speech was brief but powerful. "I'm not here to replace anyone," she told the audience. "I'm here to continue the values that should never have been forgotten: dignity, compassion, and service." The applause was thunderous. Back at Kensington Palace, William watched it unfold with a quiet smile. The two of them sat by the fire later that evening, side by side, their hands intertwined. A letter sat in William's lap, his father's handwriting trembling but steady. "Protect Catherine," it read. "She is this monarchy's light." William looked up, his eyes misty. "He sees it," he whispered. Catherine gave a small, knowing nod. "We're not doing this for titles, Will. We're doing it for your mother. And now, for your father, too." They weren't trying to claim the monarchy. They were trying to clean it, to dust off the layers of ambition, scandal, and cold tradition, and bring it back to something people could trust, something that made people feel proud again. As Catherine moved through her new role, something beautiful happened. She didn't eclipse Camilla by force. She simply allowed her natural light to shine. And the public, those who had once felt distant from the crown, began to look again, not at robes or jewels, but kindness, at consistency, at someone who showed up for the right reasons. Because in the end, it wasn't about power. It was about purpose. The silence surrounding Camilla wasn't sudden. It crept in day by day as the spotlight she had once thrived under slowly dimmed. Invitations slowed. Staff who once bustled in and out of her office moved on, quietly reassigned or dismissed. The calls, once constant from elite circles and loyal allies, became fewer, and then stopped altogether. Camilla had once been everywhere, featured on magazine covers, praised by press for her resilience, her grace under pressure. But now she found herself alone in a sprawling estate in Scotland, far from London, far from the throne, and far from the man she once stood beside. She still wore the symbols of her station: elegant pearls, designer coats, and the heavy presence of a title that no longer carried weight. But the mirror told a different story. She could barely meet her own eyes anymore. Her face, once lifted by pride, now softened by the absence of applause, looked older, not from age, but from realization. She often stood by the window with a glass of wine in hand, watching the rain streak down the glass. She whispered things to herself now, things she wouldn't have admitted even a year ago. "I did everything for the crown," she said once, almost too quietly to hear, but it echoed anyway. Back in the capital, the monarchy moved forward without her, quietly, decisively. Behind palace walls, her influence had vanished, and the headlines reflected it. News stories shifted their focus to Catherine and William. People no longer compared Camilla to Diana. They simply stopped mentioning her. Online, once loyal followers moved on, embracing the sincerity of a future led by compassion instead of control. Camilla tried to reach out, phone calls to old confidants, quiet dinners with familiar faces. But no one wanted to be attached to what the press was now calling a faded chapter of the monarchy. Support had dried up, not because people turned against her, but because they stopped needing her. And that perhaps was the hardest truth of all. In one rare moment of vulnerability, a former advisor suggested she take legal action, fight for her position, her share, her place. But Camilla, holding the ruby tiara that once symbolized everything she had fought for, shook her head. There was no battle left to fight. The war had already been lost, not to Catherine, not to the media, but to time, truth, and the choices she had made. She stared into the mirror once more. "I won the throne," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "But I lost everything." That night, for the first time, she pulled the curtains closed, not to keep the world out, but because the world had already moved on without her. And in the distance, beyond the palace gates, the legacy she had tried so hard to shape was being rewritten, not with anger, not with revenge, but with quiet grace, and a name she could never quite escape: Diana. In the soft light of early morning, King Charles sat by a large window at Sandringham. The gardens outside were alive with color, roses in full bloom, their petals swaying gently in the breeze. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful for a man carrying decades of reflection on his shoulders. He held a photograph. It was old, slightly faded at the edges, but the smile it captured still glowed with life. Diana, arms wrapped around her two young boys, her eyes full of warmth. A family once whole. A time before the choices that led them all here. Charles sighed quietly, not out of regret alone, but out of clarity. He couldn't change the past. But maybe, just maybe, he could shape the future. And so, he got to work. In a series of private meetings, Charles summoned the royal legal team. This wasn't a typical administrative update. This was a complete reworking of his legacy. At the heart of it was a decision that shocked everyone in the room. Camilla would be removed entirely from his will. No inheritance, no assets, no special privileges. A clean slate. Instead, Charles appointed William and Catherine as the guardians of the royal estate and future royal assets. Not just as heirs, but as caretakers of what the crown would represent from this point forward. But that wasn't all. Charles ordered something even more meaningful: the reestablishment of a charitable fund in Diana's name. Not just a gesture, not just a plaque or statue. A living, breathing initiative focused on the causes Diana cared most about: helping disadvantaged children, supporting struggling families, raising awareness for mental health, and creating real change. This isn't just a fund, Charles told his advisors. It's how we bring her light back. The news, though quietly handled inside palace walls, soon made its way to the public. And when it did, the reaction was overwhelming. Letters poured into the palace, some from former critics, others from everyday people, many from young families who had once benefited from Diana's compassion. One letter came from a child in Liverpool. It simply read, "Your Majesty, thank you for choosing the light. We're proud of you." Charles kept that one close. He spent his afternoons reading, writing, and overseeing every detail of Diana's fund. Though his health limited his public appearances, his mind was focused. There was no bitterness, only intention. He didn't want his reign to be remembered for scandal or division. He wanted it remembered for healing. At Kensington Palace, William and Catherine received the final letter from Charles, handwritten in his distinct, careful script. "My son," it read, "I let power blind my heart, but you see clearly now. Protect Catherine. She is the monarchy's light. And never forget what your mother taught us." William closed the letter gently, his voice soft. He found his way back. Catherine nodded, her eyes glistening. "And we'll carry it forward." The crown hadn't changed hands, but something more powerful had shifted. The monarchy wasn't chasing relevance anymore. It was choosing meaning.